They say the holidays are a time for joy, but for Clara, last Christmas was a nightmare she'll never forget. Clara loved Christmas. Her apartment was always the first in her building to be decked out with twinkling lights and wreaths. But last year, a knock on her door turned her favorite time of year into something straight out of a horror movie. It started on Christmas Eve. Clara was curled up on the couch, sipping hot cocoa and watching her favorite holiday movie. Around midnight, 3 sharp knocks echoed through her apartment. Startled, she got up to check the peephole. On the other side was a man dressed as Santa Claus, holding a small red-wrapped box. Clara hesitated. She hadn't ordered anything, and the man didn't look like anyone from her building. But curiosity got the better of her, and she cracked open the door. He handed her the box without a word, smiled, and walked away. Inside the box was a single candy cane. It looked old, the colors faded, and the plastic wrap yellowed. Something about it gave Clara a chill. She tossed it aside and locked the door. A few hours later, as she was getting ready for bed, there was another knock. Clara froze, her heart pounding. She peered through the peephole again. The same Santa was standing there, holding another red-wrapped box. This time, she didn't open the door. She called out, "Who are you?" "What do you want?" But he didn't respond. After a few minutes, he turned and walked away. When she finally worked up the courage to open the door, the box was sitting there on the welcome mat. Inside was a cracked ornament. The once beautiful glass was splintered, its surface marred with jagged lines. Clara's unease grew. She locked the door again and double-checked the windows before heading to bed. At 3 a.m., she woke to the sound of faint humming. It was coming from the living room. Slowly, she crept out of bed, clutching her phone. The Christmas tree lights were off, but a faint glow illuminated the room. Clara's stomach dropped when she saw him. The Santa was standing outside her window, grinning. She screamed, and he vanished into the darkness. The next morning, she called the police, but they found no sign of a break-in. They told her it was probably just a prank. But deep down, Clara knew it was something worse. That night, the knocking returned. This time, it didn't stop. Clara's heart raced as she called the police again, but the line was dead. Desperate, she barricaded herself in the bedroom, clutching a kitchen knife. The knocking turned into pounding, and then she heard footsteps inside the apartment. Tears streamed down her face as she braced herself for whatever was coming. But the door to her room never opened. When the pounding finally stopped, Clara crept out, shaking. The apartment was empty, but on the dining table sat a final red box. With trembling hands, she opened it. Inside was a photograph of her. The picture showed her sleeping in bed, taken from just a few feet away. Scrawled across the back in messy handwriting were the words, "Merry Christmas." Clara moved out of that apartment the next day, leaving everything behind. Every Christmas since, she's heard faint humming outside her new window. And sometimes late at night, she swears she sees a man in a Santa suit, watching from the shadows. What would you do if the holidays turned into a nightmare? Share your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe for more stories that will make you think twice about opening your door. What would you do if the forest you trusted turned against you? For Hannah, a simple hike became a fight for her life. Hannah loved hiking. The freedom of the trails, the fresh air. It was her way of escaping the stress of city life. But on one solo trip into the wilderness, she found herself trapped in a place that refused to let her leave. It was early morning when Hannah set out on her hike. The trail was quiet, the forest alive with the chirping of birds and the rustle of leaves. But as the day wore on, the sounds began to fade. By late afternoon, the forest was eerily silent, and she realized she had lost the trail. Hannah checked her map and compass, but nothing made sense. Every direction she walked seemed to lead her back to the same spot. A small circular clearing surrounded by trees so dense they blocked out the sun. At first, she laughed it off, thinking she was overreacting. But after hours of walking in circles, panic began to set in. As night fell, Hannah decided to stay put and wait for daylight. She built a small fire in the clearing and tried to keep her mind occupied. But as the flames flickered, she felt it. A presence watching her from the darkness. She turned, flashlight in hand, and scanned the tree line. For a moment, she thought she saw movement, a shadow too large to be an animal slipping between the trees. Her heart raced as she tried to convince herself it was nothing. But then she heard it, a low, guttural growl. The sound was deep, resonating through the clearing like a warning. Hannah backed closer to the fire, clutching her flashlight like a weapon. The growl came again, closer this time, and then she saw it, a pair of glowing eyes staring at her from the shadows. The creature stepped into the firelight, and Hannah's breath caught. It was massive, its body twisted and hunched, covered in fur that seemed to ripple as it moved. Its face was monstrous, a grotesque mix of human and animal features. It didn't move like it belonged to this world. Hannah froze, every instinct telling her to run, but her legs wouldn't obey. The creature tilted its head, studying her like a predator sizing up its prey. Then it lunged. She screamed and threw her flashlight at it, grabbing a burning branch from the fire and swinging it wildly. The creature recoiled, snarling, its glowing eyes narrowing. Without thinking, Hannah bolted into the forest, branches clawing at her skin as she ran. No matter how far she went, she could hear it behind her, its heavy footsteps pounding through the underbrush. The forest seemed endless, the trees closing in tighter with every step. Just when she thought she couldn't go any further, she stumbled out onto the highway. A car screeched to a stop as she collapsed onto the pavement, gasping for breath. When she looked back at the tree line, the creature was gone. But she could feel its presence, watching, waiting. Hannah never went hiking alone again. She still dreams about the clearing, the fire, and those glowing eyes. And sometimes, when she's driving late at night, she swears she sees a pair of glowing eyes in her rearview mirror. Have you ever felt trapped by something you couldn't explain? Share your story in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe for more terrifying tales. Some toys are meant to bring joy, but for Sasha, one old doll became the stuff of nightmares. Sasha's aunt had always been a bit eccentric, the type who loved collecting odd antiques and giving them as quirky gifts. But when she handed Sasha an old porcelain doll for her birthday, it turned out to be more than just an oddity. It was a curse. The doll was fragile and worn, its face painted with delicate, lifeless features. Its eyes, made of glass, seemed to follow Sasha no matter where she stood. She laughed it off at first, chalking it up to her overactive imagination, and placed the doll on a shelf in her bedroom. That night, she dreamed of footsteps echoing through her home. In the dream, the doll's glass eyes glowed faintly, and its tiny porcelain hands reached out toward her, scratching at her door. Sasha woke in a cold sweat, dismissing it as nothing more than a bad dream. But when she got up the next morning, the doll was no longer on the shelf. It was sitting on her nightstand, facing her bed. Sasha stared at the doll, her stomach churning. She was sure she'd left it on the shelf. Trying to shake the creeping unease, she placed it back where it belonged and went about her day. But that night, the nightmares returned. She dreamed of the doll again, this time crawling across her bedroom floor. Its movements were jerky, like a puppet being controlled by unseen strings. When she woke, it was on her desk, its head tilted toward her with a faint crack in its porcelain cheek that hadn't been there before. Sasha decided to get rid of it. She wrapped the doll in newspaper, stuffed it into a box, and left it outside for the garbage truck. But the following morning, it was back sitting on her kitchen counter, perfectly clean, as if it had never left. Panic set in. Sasha drove the doll to a nearby thrift store and dropped it off without a second thought. She felt relief for the first time in days, thinking she was finally free of it. But when she returned home, her blood ran cold. The doll was waiting for her, sitting in the middle of her living room, its head now turned slightly to the side, as though mocking her. That night, Sasha locked the doll in her closet and braced a chair against the door. But around 3 a.m., she woke to the sound of something scratching against the wood. She froze, heart pounding, as the scratching turned to faint whispers. "I missed you," the voice said, soft and childlike. Sasha grabbed her phone and fled the apartment, not stopping until she was miles away. When she returned the next day, the doll was gone, but her relief was short-lived. In its place was a single note, written in jagged handwriting. "See you soon." Sasha moved to a new city shortly after, but the nightmares never stopped. Sometimes she hears whispers in the dark, and every so often she finds small porcelain shards left on her doorstep. Have you ever owned something you couldn't explain? Tell us in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe for more stories that will keep you checking the shadows. What would you do if a seemingly harmless gift felt more like a threat? For Nadia, a single flower was just the beginning. Nadia had always been cautious when traveling, especially on long drives at night. But one stop at a roadside motel changed everything, leaving her with questions that still haunt her. It started when Nadia's car broke down late at night on an empty stretch of road. With no cell service and no towns nearby, she spotted a flickering motel sign in the distance and decided to walk there for help. The motel was as run down as they came. Faded paint, broken lights, and a receptionist who barely glanced at her as he handed her a room key. Exhausted, Nadia didn't care. She locked the door, threw her bag onto the bed, and fell asleep almost instantly. But at 3 a.m., she woke to the sound of soft tapping. Her heart raced as she glanced at the door. The knob was rattling slightly as though someone was trying to open it. Nadia grabbed her phone and approached cautiously, peering through the peephole. No one was there. When she finally opened the door, the only thing she found was a small white flower hanging from the knob. Confused but trying to stay calm, Nadia picked up the flower and tossed it onto the nightstand. She convinced herself it was just a harmless prank, or maybe something left by mistake. Still, she locked the door again and placed a chair under the handle, just to be safe. The next morning, she packed up quickly and handed her key back to the receptionist. "Who left the flower on my door last night?" she asked. The man frowned. "Flower? We don't do that here." Feeling uneasy, Nadia brushed it off and headed to her car, relieved that it had been towed to the motel overnight. But as she opened the door to get in, her stomach dropped. Another white flower was sitting on the driver's seat, its petals pristine despite the dusty interior. Her heart pounded as she scanned the empty parking lot. No one was there. She grabbed the flower and threw it out, slamming the car door before speeding off. Hours later, as she neared her destination, Nadia finally began to relax. The memory of the flower seemed distant, almost absurd. But when she pulled into a gas station and stepped out to stretch, she froze. A third flower was sitting on the windshield, placed delicately under the wiper. Her breath hitched as she looked around, scanning every car and shadow for a sign of someone watching. But there was no one. When she reached for the flower, a folded piece of paper slipped out from beneath it. With trembling hands, she opened it. The note read, "You can't outrun me." Nadia's vision blurred with panic. She jumped back into the car and drove without stopping until she reached her destination. But even as she pulled into her driveway, she couldn't shake the feeling that she wasn't alone. Nadia eventually sold her car, convinced it was cursed. But the flowers didn't stop. They began appearing at her doorstep, on her desk at work, even inside her locked apartment. To this day, she doesn't know who or what is leaving them, but she's afraid of the day she finds out. What would you do if you couldn't escape a warning? Let us know in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe for more chilling tales of the unexplained. Mannequins are supposed to stay still, right? For Mia and her cousin, that wasn't the case when they broke into an abandoned department store. Mia had always been the adventurous type, the kind of person who loved exploring creepy places just for the thrill. But when her cousin dared her to sneak into an old abandoned department store one night, she had no idea what she was walking into. The store had been closed for over a decade, its dusty windows and boarded-up doors standing as a silent reminder of a bygone era. Mia and her cousin, Tasha, found a side entrance that had been pried open and slipped inside. The air was thick and stale, and their flashlights barely cut through the darkness. "Creepy, but kinda cool," Tasha whispered, her voice echoing through the empty aisles. The mannequins were the first thing they noticed. Scattered throughout the store, they stood frozen in awkward poses, their chipped faces and missing limbs making them look more grotesque than glamorous. At first, it was fun. They laughed and posed the mannequins in silly positions, snapping pictures on their phones. But then, Mia noticed something strange. One of the mannequins was standing in the middle of the aisle, facing them. She was sure it hadn't been there a moment ago. "Did you move that one?" Mia asked, her voice unsteady. Tasha shook her head. "No, I thought you did." They shrugged it off and continued exploring, but the unease lingered. As they moved deeper into the store, Mia couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. The mannequins seemed to multiply, appearing in places they hadn't been before. At one point, Mia turned a corner and gasped. A mannequin was standing at the end of the aisle, its head tilted toward her. Its blank face seemed almost expressive in the dim light, like it was waiting. "Let's get out of here," she whispered, grabbing Tasha's arm. But Tasha hesitated. "Come on, it's just some old props. Don't freak out." Before Mia could argue, the lights flickered. Just once, but enough to send her heart racing. When they came back on, the mannequin was closer. Mia didn't wait to see what happened next. She grabbed Tasha and bolted toward the exit. But every time they turned a corner, more mannequins blocked their path. The store seemed to twist and shift around them, the aisles narrowing, forcing them deeper into the labyrinth of shadows. The final straw came when Mia glanced back and saw one of the mannequins moving. Not jerky, mechanical movements, but smooth and fluid, like a person walking. Its head turned toward her, and it raised a hand, beckoning. They found the exit door, but it wouldn't budge. The mannequins were closing in now, their hollow faces glowing faintly in the flickering light. In desperation, Mia grabbed a metal rod from the floor and smashed the glass. They scrambled out into the cold night air, hearts pounding. As they caught their breath, Mia glanced back at the store. Through the broken window, she could see the mannequins standing in the shadows, watching. And then one of them waved. Mia and Tasha never spoke of that night again. They deleted the photos and avoided the area entirely. But sometimes, late at night, Mia feels the same uneasy sensation she had in the store. And once, just once, she swears she saw a mannequin in the reflection of her living room window. Have you ever seen something move when it shouldn't have? Tell us your story in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe for more chilling tales. What would you do if a passenger vanished from your car? For Elena, a late-night shift as a rideshare driver became her worst nightmare. Elena had been driving for a rideshare app for months. The hours were long, but the pay was decent, and she enjoyed the quiet of late-night drives. That was until one ride changed everything, leaving her questioning what was real. It was a little past midnight when Elena got a ping for a pickup in a quiet residential neighborhood. She pulled up to the curb, where a tall figure waited under a flickering streetlight. He wore a long coat, and his face was hidden beneath the brim of a hat. The man slid into the back seat without a word, nodding curtly when she confirmed his destination. Something about him made her uneasy. Maybe it was his silence, or the way he avoided eye contact. Still, she chalked it up to the usual awkwardness of strangers. As they drove, Elena glanced at him in the rearview mirror. That's when she noticed it. His silhouette looked wrong. His shoulders were too broad, his limbs too long, and his head seemed to tilt at an unnatural angle. Elena gripped the steering wheel tighter, telling herself she was imagining things. But the unease grew with every passing mile. The passenger hadn't moved or said a word, and the air in the car felt colder, almost suffocating. She stole another glance in the mirror and froze. The man was staring at her now, his face partially illuminated by passing streetlights. But his features didn't look human. His eyes were wide and reflective, like a predator, and his mouth stretched into a grin that was too sharp, too large. Heart pounding, Elena forced herself to keep driving. "Everything okay back there?" she asked, her voice trembling. The man didn't respond. Instead, he leaned forward, his grin widening. Elena's blood turned to ice as she realized something else. His reflection in the mirror didn't match his position in the seat. It was leaning closer, while his body remained still. Panic took over. Elena slammed on the brakes, the car skidding to a halt on the empty road. She whipped around to confront him, but the back seat was empty. Her breath came in shallow gasps as she scanned the car. The passenger door was still locked, and there was no sign anyone had been there. She checked the app, expecting to find his name or a profile, but the ride had disappeared from her history. As she sat there, trying to process what had just happened, her phone buzzed with a notification. A new ride request had come through. The pickup address? The exact spot where she'd dropped him off. Elena didn't accept the ride. She drove straight home, shaking, and deleted the app the next day. But sometimes, late at night, her phone buzzes with a notification. And every time, the pickup location is the same as that night. Would you keep driving after a ride like this? Tell us in the comments, and make sure to subscribe for more stories that might make you rethink the ordinary. The scar that tick-tocked. Have you ever had a scar that itched? For Elena, it wasn't just an itch. It was a warning of something far worse beneath the surface. Elena had always hated the scar on her arm. A souvenir from a childhood accident, it stretched jagged and pale across her forearm, a reminder of a day she'd rather forget. But one night, the scar wasn't just a mark anymore. It became alive. It started with a faint itch as Elena lay on her couch, scrolling through her phone. At first, she ignored it, scratching absent-mindedly while watching videos. But the itch grew sharper, more insistent, and soon she couldn't think about anything else. She rubbed the scar harder, trying to soothe it, but then she felt something strange, a vibration beneath her skin. Frowning, she pressed her fingers against the scar, and her heart sank. The scar wasn't just itching, it was ticking, a faint, rhythmic pulse like a clock. Elena sat up, panic prickling at the edges of her thoughts. She pressed on the scar again, harder this time. It felt hollow, like there was a space beneath her skin. The ticking grew louder with every second, a steady beat that echoed unnaturally through the silence of her apartment. She grabbed her phone to record it, thinking she was losing her mind. But as she hit record, the sound abruptly stopped. The silence that followed was suffocating. Elena held her breath, waiting, listening. And then she heard it again. But it wasn't coming from her arm anymore. It was coming from down the hall. The hallway stretched, dark and empty, lit only by the faint glow of her bedroom light. Elena's pulse quickened as she took slow, deliberate steps toward the sound. It was louder now, resonating through the floorboards. It wasn't just a ticking anymore. It was a low, mechanical hum, like gears grinding together. She pushed open the door to her bedroom and froze. The ticking was coming from her dresser drawer. Her stomach churned as she reached for the handle, half expecting something to jump out. But when she pulled it open, all she found was an old wristwatch, one she didn't recognize. Its face was cracked, and its hands spun wildly, ticking faster and faster as she stared at it. Alina reached out to touch the watch, but as her fingers grazed the surface, the ticking stopped completely. The silence was deafening, pressing in on her from all sides. She held her breath, waiting for something to happen. Then she felt it, a sharp, searing pain in her arm. She looked down, horrified to see her scar splitting open. From the jagged wound, something metallic began to emerge. It was a thin, gleaming wire, uncoiling like a snake from beneath her skin. Alina screamed, clawing at her arm, but the wire just kept coming, wrapping itself around her wrist like a shackle. The lights in her room flickered violently as the watch on the dresser began to tick again, louder than ever. And then, the ticking stopped once more. In the silence, a voice spoke, low and mechanical. "Time's up!" The wire tightened around her wrist, pulling her arm forward as the room seemed to collapse around her. The last thing she saw was the watch face, glowing faintly in the dark, before everything went black. Alina woke up the next morning on her couch, drenched in sweat. Her arm throbbed, and when she looked down, the scar was back, perfectly healed, as if nothing had happened. But the ticking still echoed faintly in her ears, and she couldn't shake the feeling that something had been left unfinished. To this day, she won't go near old clocks or watches. She says it's because she can still hear them ticking, a warning she can't escape. And every night, as she drifts off to sleep, she checks her arm, wondering if the wire will come back. What would you do if your own body turned against you? Share your thoughts in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe for more stories that will keep you on edge. You ever take a picture that changes your life forever? Amelia did, and she'll never touch her phone the same way again. Late one night, Amelia was scrolling through her phone, half asleep and restless. Just for fun, she decided to snap a quick selfie. What she saw would haunt her for the rest of her life. This isn't just a ghost story. It's a warning. Amelia had always loved photography, capturing every little moment that caught her eye. But that night, as she took a selfie in her dimly lit bedroom, she immediately froze. Behind her, in the dark corner of the room, was a faint face, smiling. The grin was wide, unnaturally so, with teeth that seemed far too sharp for a human. Shaking, Amelia deleted the photo without hesitation. She convinced herself it was just a trick of the light. The corner of her room was always cluttered with boxes and old furniture. Surely it was nothing more than shadows. But the feeling of being watched lingered, an unsettling pressure she couldn't shake. A few minutes later, as she scrolled through her gallery, her heart dropped. The photo was back. It sat there like it had never been deleted, the same chilling smile waiting for her. Amelia stared at the screen, bile rising in her throat. She deleted it again. Then, for good measure, she cleared her entire photo gallery. Surely that would fix it. But as she backed out of the gallery, she saw it again, front and center on her home screen. A notification from her Photos app, displaying the cursed image. Panic set in. Amelia jumped out of bed, turned on every light in the room, and checked every corner. Nothing. Her bedroom was empty except for the flickering shadows cast by her lamp. But when she looked at her phone again, the picture had changed. The face was clearer now. It wasn't smiling anymore. The grin had morphed into a scowl, and the faint outline of shoulders and arms had begun to form. The figure was leaning closer, as if trying to crawl through the screen. Amelia's heart raced as she tried to shut off her phone, but it wouldn't power down. The screen remained on, the photo growing sharper with every second. The face now filled the entire screen, its eyes locked onto hers. She threw the phone across the room, but instead of shattering, it landed upright, the photo still glaring at her from the screen. Suddenly, the lights flickered and went out. The room plunged into darkness, leaving only the faint glow of her phone. And then she heard it. A low, guttural whisper. It wasn't coming from the phone. It was coming from the corner of the room. "I see you!" Amelia screamed, scrambling for the door, but the handle wouldn't budge, as though it had been welded shut. She turned, her back pressed against the wall, as the figure stepped out of the shadows. It was tall and crooked, its movements jerky like a puppet on strings. Its face was the same one from the photo, but now it was grinning again, impossibly wide. No one knows exactly what happened to Amelia that night. When her friends came looking for her the next day, they found her bedroom empty. No sign of struggle, no broken locks. Her phone lay on the bed, screen cracked, but still glowing. And the last photo in the gallery, it wasn't of Amelia. It was of them, her friends, standing in her bedroom, staring at the empty bed. Do you think you'd survive an encounter like this? Let us know your thoughts in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe for more stories that might just keep you up tonight. Have you ever felt completely alone, only to realize you weren't? For Lila, a solo camping trip became a night she'll never forget. Lila was no stranger to the wilderness. She'd spent years hiking and camping, relishing the peace and solitude of being far from civilization. But her last trip into the forest taught her that sometimes solitude isn't as peaceful as it seems. It was a quiet autumn evening, and Lila had set up camp deep in the woods, far from any trail or other campers. The air was crisp, and the fire crackled softly as she sipped tea under a canopy of stars. It was the perfect escape, until she climbed into her tent. As she lay on her sleeping bag, staring at the faint glow of the moonlight through the fabric, she noticed a shadow. It stretched across the side of the tent, tall and human-shaped. Lila froze, her mind racing. She hadn't heard anyone approach, and she was miles from the nearest trail. Her first instinct was to call out, but her voice caught in her throat. She reached for the knife she always kept nearby, her hand trembling as she gripped it tightly. The shadow didn't move. It just stood there, perfectly still. Lila told herself it was nothing, a trick of the light, maybe a tree swaying in the breeze. But as she watched, the shadow began to shift. Slowly, it leaned forward, as though peering into the tent. Heart pounding, Lila grabbed her flashlight and unzipped the tent in one swift motion. She shined the light into the darkness, her breath visible in the cold night air. There was nothing there. The campsite was empty, and the forest was eerily silent. She stepped outside, scanning the area. Still nothing. But when she turned back to the tent, her blood ran cold. The shadow was still there, inside now, as if someone was standing in the middle of the tent. Lila backed away, her flashlight shaking in her hands. The tent collapsed suddenly, as though whatever had been inside had lunged at the fabric. She screamed, dropping the light, and turned to run. But the forest seemed darker, the trees closing in around her as she stumbled through the underbrush. Behind her, she heard it, a low guttural growl. She turned just in time to see a pair of glowing eyes in the shadows. They blinked once, twice, and then disappeared. Lila didn't wait to see what else might be out there. She ran harder than she ever had before, her breath ragged as she finally reached the trailhead. The next morning, she returned with a park ranger to retrieve her gear. The campsite was untouched, except for her tent, which lay in shreds. The ranger shrugged it off as a bear, but Lila knew better. She'd seen those eyes, and sometimes, late at night, she still feels them watching from the darkness. Would you ever camp alone after hearing this story? Let us know in the comments and subscribe for more terrifying tales from the unknown. Have you ever seen something move in the corner of your eye, only to realize it was watching you back? Jasmine did, and what happened next will make you think twice about turning off the lights. It started like any other quiet evening for Jasmine. She just moved into a small studio apartment downtown, a place with old-world charm and creaky wooden floors. But on her first night alone, something strange happened that she can't explain. After unpacking for hours, Jasmine decided to call it a night. She turned off the lights, leaving the faint glow of the city through her window to guide her to the couch. But as she settled in, she noticed a shadow on the far wall, long and narrow, stretching unnaturally high. At first, she thought it was hers, distorted by the moonlight filtering through the blinds. She waved her hand, expecting the shadow to mimic her movement. It didn't. Instead, it froze for a moment, then shifted, twisting its head like it was studying her. Her heart skipped. Shadows don't move on their own, she thought. She grabbed her phone and turned on the flashlight, sweeping it across the wall. The shadow vanished, but when she turned off the flashlight, it was back closer this time. Jasmine sat frozen, her mind racing through rational explanations. Maybe it was just a trick of the light? But deep down, she knew better. The shadow didn't just linger. It seemed to breathe, its edges pulsating faintly like it was alive. She decided to test it again. Slowly, she raised her hand, and the shadow hesitated before copying her. But as she moved her hand down, the shadow did something that made her blood run cold. It raised its other hand instead. A low creaking sound came from the floorboards behind her. She whipped around, shining the flashlight in every direction. The room was empty. Still, the feeling of being watched wouldn't leave her. Jasmine's eyes darted to the mirror above her dresser. There it was again, not on the wall this time, but inside the glass. The shadow was clearer now, its elongated limbs and hollow face pressed against the surface, as though trapped within the reflection. As panic set in, Jasmine grabbed a blanket and threw it over the mirror, covering the eerie figure. But the moment she did, she felt cold breath against her neck. "You shouldn't have done that," a voice whispered, low and raspy. Jasmine bolted for the door, yanking it open and stumbling into the hallway. But as she looked back into her apartment, her breath caught. The shadow had emerged from the mirror and stood in the middle of the room. Its arms stretched wide like it was inviting her back. Its head tilted, and then it grinned, a twisted, impossible smile. The lights in the hallway began to flicker. One by one they went out, plunging the space into darkness. Jasmine ran, her bare feet slapping against the cold tile as she made her way to the stairs. But no matter how fast she moved, she could feel it behind her, the weight of its gaze, the sound of its footsteps matching hers. She burst out onto the street, gasping for air, and turned back to look at the building. Her apartment window glowed faintly, the shadow standing behind the glass, watching her. Jasmine never returned to that apartment. She left the city the next day, abandoning everything she owned. But even now, she avoids mirrors and refuses to be alone in dark rooms. Because every so often, when the light is just right, she swears she can see it, the shadow waiting patiently in the corners, for her to let her guard down. Have you ever felt like something was watching you in the dark? Share your story in the comments. And don't forget to subscribe for more tales that will make you question what's lurking in the shadows. Have you ever felt someone's eyes on you, only to discover no one was there? For Lena, that gaze followed her everywhere. Lena loved the charm of small-town diners, the warm service and homemade meals. But one late-night stop on her road trip became a surreal nightmare she couldn't escape. It was just past midnight when Lena pulled into a small diner off the highway. The place was nearly empty, except for a truck driver sitting at the counter and a teenage boy sitting in a booth across the room. He was maybe 10 or 11, dressed in outdated clothes, and staring straight at her. She tried to ignore him as she slid into a booth, but his gaze never wavered. Lena smiled politely, hoping he'd stop, but he didn't blink. Uneasy, she flagged down the server. "Is that boy okay?" she asked quietly. The server frowned. "What boy?" Lena's blood ran cold as she gestured toward the booth, but when she looked back, it was empty. "I must be tired," she muttered, trying to laugh it off. As her meal arrived, she caught sight of the boy again, now sitting in a booth closer to her. He didn't move or make a sound. His dark eyes locked onto hers. Lena's stomach churned. She leaned toward the server again. "You seriously don't see him?" The server gave her a wary look, but before she could respond, the bell above the diner door jingled. Lena turned to see if the boy had left, but the booth was empty once more. Shaken, Lena quickly finished her food and paid her bill. She stepped outside into the cool night air, relieved to be heading back to her car. But as she opened the door, she froze. The boy was sitting in the back seat, staring at her through the rearview mirror. Lena slammed the door shut and backed away, her heart pounding. When she looked again, the back seat was empty. Telling herself it was a hallucination, she climbed into the car and sped away, her hands trembling on the wheel. Miles down the road, Lena glanced in the mirror again and screamed. The boy was there, his face inches from hers, but his expression had changed. His mouth was stretched into a wide, unnatural grin. Lena veered off the road, the car skidding to a halt on the gravel shoulder. She jumped out, gasping for air, but when she turned to look inside, the boy was gone. All that remained was a single handprint on the foggy glass of the back window. Lena refused to drive alone at night after that, but no matter where she goes, she sometimes feels those dark eyes watching her. And every so often, when she looks into a mirror, she swears she sees him standing just behind her. Have you ever felt like you were being followed? Tell us your story in the comments and subscribe for more tales that will keep you looking over your shoulder.